So the chunk of land that I'm interested in is called Xuanda, which you won't find on any modern maps, but it's from the two garrison cities of Xuanhua and Datong. And the this is an area which has always been the northern border of China. So it's cut off from the North China Plain by the Great Taihang Range, which is a range of low but actually very rugged and difficult to cross mountains. And to the north, it stretches for a few hundred kilometers until it reaches the edge of the steppe lands where the Mongols lived. And so during the Ming Dynasty, um, for all of Chinese history, it's been a part of land that's been fought over between Chinese dynasties and the people of the steppe. And during the Ming Dynasty, which is from the 1380s to the 1636, I should know this. The it became essentially sort of the interwall region. So there were two lines of the Great Wall, one of which ran along the Taihang Range and protected the North China Plain, and the second one ran north of Xuanda, north of Datong, north of Zhangjiakou, the great garrisons of the north. And this region in between the two walls was sort of the catchment area for Mongol raiding. So a Mongol raid, when it was coming south, would probably be able to punch through the first line, but it would get hemmed up in the various valleys and sort of garrison cities in this region. It would never actually cross the Taihang, and only one raid for the whole Ming Dynasty ever did cross the Taihang and reach into the North Chinese plains. So this is and this chunk of land is the chunk of land I'm interested in. I'm trying to sort of describe the history and visual culture of this part of the world, and this is the place where I'm going back to work. And Yu County, which is where I had been working previously, is one county within the broader region of Xuanda. So just a bit about the place, about the way people live there. When I don't get interested in places that I haven't been to. I like to kind of be able to smell and be able to touch the things that I'm studying. So so I'll just tell you a bit about that. So it's a very dry place. You're on the edge of the desert. It's these wide open plains which are covered in prairie and farms, and which are cut through by these steep, not particularly tall, but extremely rugged and rocky and kind of brambly mountain ranges which rise abruptly out of the plains. And in some places you have these loess hills which are kind of blown up against the higher ranges. And you get these very hilly areas with these, which is all, terraced, or at least it was until recently, and cut through by these deep canyons. So here you can see one of the mountain ranges from the wall of a fortress, and then one of the watchtowers, which guards the valley that leads into Yu County from the north. And historically speaking, from the 16th century on, almost everything here would have had a wall around it. This was a region which was at all times prepared for war. So all of the villages, all of the monasteries, all of the settlements of any type would have been surrounded by a mud wall. If they were wealthy enough to afford it, they would build a brick wall. So here you can see two fortress villages of the type that I'm interested in, with these mud walls rising out from among the fields. And just physical culture stuff. People lived in these, sort of Chinese-style courtyard houses where, the rooms of the house are arrayed around a central courtyard, and they might be nested if it was a big family or a wealthy family, several courtyards deep. And you have these beautiful old lattice windows, which would be, you would have a wooden lattice, and then you put wax paper behind it so that light could get through, and you could close in the winter or open it in the summer. These are just two fairly well-preserved old houses, and here you can see a village street. You'd have these long, straight mud streets which lead in grids through the walled villages, and people, because your house was a closed courtyard and people from the street couldn't see in, you'd put a lot of wealth and effort into making a beautiful doorway that led out into the street. So you have these very elaborate gatehouses which lead into each courtyard and have all this beautiful sort of carving and beautiful brickwork on them. And so in 2014, when I spent my time, as I said, I spent about a year and a half in this part of the world. And mainly at the time, what I was interested in was fortresses. Was interested in the history of village, fortified villages in this area, and where do they come from and what do they do. And so the way that you can find that out is you go around and you collect gatehouse plaques. So when you built a fortress, you needed a gate, and over the gate you would put a small stone which gave a particular set of information. So here you can see one, and you can see this is pretty typical. So it gives a small roster of information. It gives the name of the fort. It gives the sort of administrative address of the fort. So what under what government systems did it consider itself to be ruled, and that's quite interesting from a social historical point of view. And then it gives the names of the leaders of the fort and the leaders of the military subdivisions within the fort, and then the artisans, and this you can do kind of clan analysis. What were the main families within each fort? And then it gives you sort of a variety of other information. Sometimes it gives you the artisans, sometimes it tells you, gives sort of a prayer or invocation or little story about how they built the fort, and then it gives you the date. In this case, it's, let's see, what's the date here? It is 1547, which is pretty much standard as these dates go. And nobody had ever done a survey of these inscriptions for the reason that they're super high up. So until zoom cameras became common, there was no way to really read them unless you were going to lug a huge ladder around. And so I actually did the first survey of these things, so far as I know. Since then, a group of architectural historians from Tianjin University has repeated the survey that I did, which, damn it. But so I went around to about 380 of these places, of which, say, about 150 had extant gates with plaques on them. Of those, about 50, 60 recorded in some way the date of the foundation of the fort. And when you graph them out, they look like this. So you see that almost all of the forts in Yu County were built between roughly 1500 and 1555. And I think the ones that are marked as later are basically just mistakes. They, when they put the plaque up, they didn't specify that they were actually repairing the gate. They weren't building it for the first time. So this landscape essentially came into existence in the 1500s. And what happened, and you can back this up by reading the historical records from the period, and there were books that were written how to fortify your village. What happened is that the Ming frontier collapsed. The Chinese frontier collapsed from the middle of the 15th, latter part of the 15th century, and they began to be raided every year by these incredibly destructive raids where, Altan Khan and his, 15,000, they called them the Iron Riders, would punch across the border and ride out across the countryside of Shranda, kind of raiding and pillaging whatever they could get. And essentially anybody who didn't build a fortress was killed. And after 80 years of this happening every single autumn when the horses were fat, there was nothing left. There was no really identifiable thing, whether it was a village or it was a monastery or anything, which didn't have a defensive system around it, because anything that didn't got burned. And so, you're talking about a landscape here which was created in a single historical cataclysm, which is something I'm really interested in. One of my big goals is to write a history of that process, but that's kind of subsidiary right now to the mural thing. Another way you can know this history is through the work of this guy named Willem Groter. And so Willem Groter was a Belgian missionary, Catholic missionary who in the 1930s was sent to Datouan. And Groter was actually a very, very intelligent man. And importantly for what he later did, his members of his family were deeply involved in sort of the Belgian schools of linguistics and dialectology. So his father was involved in producing these huge atlases of the Belgian and Flemish and French dialects across Belgium and how they spread. And I think Roter's sort of great idea in life was that you could apply dialectology, the study of linguistics, to the study of religion. And so in the 1940s, and in the middle of the Sino-Japanese War, he bought a donkey and sort of set out to survey villages in the plains of North China, and their armies were sort of passing to the left and right of him. He notes that everybody assumed he was a spy, but he just went to a couple hundred villages and gathered as much information as he could about the contents of the temples there, and tried to demonstrate what were the processes that allowed, that controlled the flow of sort of historical religious traits. And so Hrothers wasn't interested in fortresses, and he wasn't collecting dates of fortresses. But if you take everything that he, all of the dates that he did, he was able to gather, and you subtract those dates which come from things which he mentions were not fortified villages, so things which come from large monasteries, or things which come from large walled cities which had been walled for 1500 years or something like that, and you look at just the village dates, and then you graph that out. You see that so here's the graph. You can see that the graph of the dates matches almost exactly the graph of the fortresses from Yu County, which is next door to Hrothers areas. So essentially the people in this area started building their temples in the end of the 15th century, roughly around 1475, and almost all of the temples were founded over the course of the first half of the 16th century, ending around 1560 or so. So the as this landscape was fortified, it also kind of got religion. So you can say, okay, this was a movement which was about fortification and it was about self-defense, but it was also a religious movement which swept across the plains, and every village rebuilt its temples completely. And it turns out that they rebuilt them in ways that are related to the fortress. So the temples are not located randomly around the village. Temples are associated with particular parts of the village and actually couldn't exist without that part of the village being there. So here, for instance, is a temple to Avalokiteshvara Guanyin, who is an important Buddhist god. It's located outside of the southern the southern gate of the village, facing in. You can see that it's positioned very intentionally, and it couldn't have existed in that location without the gatehouse being there first. So if you have that temple from a particular gate, that means you also had the gatehouse from the particular gate, because it would have been impossible to position that temple unless the gate and the village had already existed with it. And most of these villages are axial, so you go in through the southern gate and you have this straight axial street which leads to, usually there's a temple to Avalokiteshvara Guanyin outside of the straight axial gate to the south, and then if you go in and you see at the northern end of the street, there'll be this massive kind of temple tower, this stepped temple which is built into the northern wall of the gate and has this kind of commanding panoptical view over the whole village. So here, this is all from one village. So there's a Avalokiteshvara temple outside of it to the south, and then you go in and you go up this straight street to the temple at the north. Here it is. If you go around, I think the lower one is to Zhenwu, the perfected warrior, who's a Taoist god, and the upper one is to Yu Huang, the Jade Emperor. And it's a literal watchtower which is built into the northern wall of the village. So and you could stand on this thing, which to the south you could see over the enclosure, the square enclosure of your village, and B, if you look to the north, you could see out across the plains to the north, where you'd see the dust clouds of Mongol warriors riding down on you. So these were temples which were A, built at the same time as the forts, and then B, sort of strongly associated with particular parts of the forts and marked it in that way. And so if you go around and map villages, you see that these are actually very closely planned settlements, and these temples were located usually one on either end of the main axial north-south street, but they could be elaborated out to other parts of the villages as well. So this was a religious system which was sort of spatially determined in a lot of ways. You also have And I'm not going to talk about this much here because it's I think it's interesting, but nobody else does. You also have a huge body of stelae stone inscriptions which are associated with these things, which will tell you when they were built, why they were built in that particular place. Um, and so if you graph out, so this is talking about just U County, and I'm getting this from a book, a collected book of these, but if you graph out, this is of some hundreds of stelae. So if you graph out when things were built and when things were rebuilt in this county from these stelae stone inscriptions, you actually get a fairly nuanced sort of physical history of these villages. These are from 24 villages and over 100 steles. So you see that there a small number of things were founded in the 16th century. Actually, for whatever reason, when you founded the thing in that time, you didn't tend to put up a stone about it, or the stones just aren't around. Probably since you were being attacked, you had more interesting things to do than to spend your time carving a stone. But you see suddenly from around the first half of the 18th century, from 1700 on, you have this massive spike in things being built, newly established, but really what you have a spike in is things being rebuilt, which sort of implies that the majority of the landscape was established, the majority of buildings were established in the first half of the 16th century. And then for 150 years, you didn't really need to do anything. I mean, you had your temples; they were all built. You didn't need to do much. And then 150 years had gone by, and en masse, these buildings, which had all been established in the 16th century, started to fall over. They just got old, and then you had to repair them. And by this point, you were at peace. Sorry, I should have said this. So the fighting basically ended around 1572. So after that point. There was no more significant warfare in this part of the world until the Japanese invasion in the 1930s. So you had a long period of peace, and you had the time to A, repair your old temples, and then B, start putting up stelae texts and stone inscriptions saying why you were doing it. We such pious people of this village, because our temple has gotten old and it's starting to fall over. We are. This is mostly what these things say. We are repairing it, and we're, painting such and such things on the walls, etc. And then you have this long period of sort of peace and prosperity from about 1570 to the 1930s. And, especially in the latter half of that period, you have this continual rebuilding and then elaboration of that landscape. So things do get newly founded. There's lots of so the street plans are established by this point. You have the fortress, you have the gates and the places, but you can add a new temple here, and you can add a new temple there, and you can add another wing on this temple, which will have a new god in it, and you get these actually very beautiful and complex architectural spaces, which were gridded out in the 16th century, but sort of elaborated and found their present form over the course of the kind of long golden era of the the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in this region. And this latter period is the period from which most of the extant murals, which is what we're talking about after all, exist. So although they were of course based on earlier forms, so most of the mural painting was fairly sort of iconographic. So you were copying early iconographic compositions that you already knew. There's some stuff from the 16th century, and it's always very exciting when you found it. Because like, 16th century, it comes from the original fortification period. But this is, and then of course the communists take over in 1548. After 1566, the Cultural Revolution begins. A huge 95% of it is destroyed. U County survives much better than anywhere else for the reason that they and actually not during the Cultural Revolution, but during the 70s and 80s in other parts of China or other parts of Shranda, when they built, they would build these kind of new, modern villages, and they would knock down the old village and put up the new village on top of it, whereas in U County, they would put the modern village outside of the gates of the old village and just abandon the old village. So you have about 300, 400, more like 400, 500 Ming Dynasty villages, which are just kind of sitting there and nobody really lives in them anymore. So this is but for instance, and that's the case in U County, for instance, in the areas in which Hrotears work, everything is gone. And everything Roter saw is now completely vanished, and there's no trace of it anymore. So it survives really differentially in different areas according to local building policy and according to what happened in each different county during the Cultural Revolution, whether the local party bosses were particularly severe or whether there was real fighting between different Red Guard groups. And now, as I've shown earlier, pretty much anything can happen to this stuff. So some villages, they've tried to, they've totally repaired it all. Some villages, they've preserved the old murals. Some villages, they haven't. Some villages, it's all been robbed. Some villages, it's just been abandoned. Everybody left. It's all sitting there. It's a total grab bag of different things. So anyway, so that's the landscape, historical landscape, which produced the mural art that I'm going to talk about.